My name's EJ Monagalland. I'm from the Department of Biology, and I lead the Interdisciplinary Centre of Conservation Science and also the Oxford Martin Programme on Biodiversity and Society, along with Nat Seddon and Yadvinder Mali. And Sangeeta is one of our Oxford Martin School Biodiversity Fellows, visiting the Biodiversity and Society Programme. So we're really, really happy to have her here at the Oxford Martin School to give her talk about her fellowship and some of the things she's been working on. So Sangeeta started off as a coral reef biologist. She did her PhD at Southern Cross University on reproduction and recruitment of corals in Kenya. But then she moved into more into practice. So she had some time at the Queensland Park Service and the Department for Natural Resources in Australia. And then she worked for a range of different international organizations in Fiji and other areas, so including IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, Cordio, WWF, WCS for a long time as the country director for WCS Fiji. So she has a huge amount of experience in actually doing conservation on the ground. She has recently become the principal scientist at Talanoa Consulting in Fiji, and I'm sure she'll tell us a bit about that organization. She's sat on so many committees, boards, she's had loads of recognition of distinction and lots of papers, blogs and technical guides. It's really very impressive to see what she's done. And her programs broadly are on gender, co-production and equitable and effective marine governance. I first met her because we're both Pew Marine Fellows, and her Pew Marine Fellowship is on mainstreaming gender and human rights into coastal fisheries management. And I was very, very impressed with her, just her programs, her deep knowledge and understanding, both from academic and practice, of how to actually make gender mainstreaming and human rights work in real life. So that's why I'm so excited that she's here to do her OMS fellowship, which is on building climate resilience in Fijian fisheries through a gender lens. So please welcome Sangeeta, and thank you very much for coming. Oh, one more thing for the online people. We'll be taking the Q&A offline, because then we can talk very openly here. But online people, Sangeeta would be very happy to answer any questions that you put into the chat afterwards. So if you put a question in the chat, Sangeeta will get back to you with answers to the questions. And people here, once we've finished the talk, then we will move into a nice, frank, open discussion of some of the issues that you raised. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Great. So, Nisambula Vinaka, which means a very warm hello from the Fiji Islands. Thank you very much to the Oxford Martin School and ICCS for this fellowship that is allowing me to be here for 9 weeks, and really excited the opportunity to get to know, hopefully, many of you in this period, and all the wonderful work that you are also doing as well. I thought to start off with, I would maybe share some voices from Fiji. And what I'm going to play for you, just 30 seconds, is the voices of some staff from WWF. And it was literally the last workshop I did before I flew out. And we'd just finished a 2-day training on gender equity and social inclusion. And they wanted to finish this with a song, which is a very sort of typical way that happens in the Pacific, and how we like to end sometimes our workshops. Great. And if you were actually visiting, this is an image of a Fijian village, and you're visiting that sound would become incredibly familiar to you, because it's really a culture where there's so much song and singing. I am not going to sing for you at the end, because my voice is not as harmonious as theirs. So we'll skip that one. So obviously my talk is going to be about the integration of rights-based approaches into conservation. And like EJ said, I've spent like 6 years of my life now working with international NGOs, particularly on marine conservation. And over half of that, I've worked in local Indigenous communities, largely in West Papua and in my own home country in Fiji. And I currently left, finally, after decades of working for conservation organizations, decided to take a break, and I joined a group called Talanoa Consulting. And I actually put up the definition of Talanoa on my slide, and hopefully if you've been here a bit early, you've had a chance to read it, because Talanoa is really kind of quite core to doing conservation in Fiji and very much part of our lives. And in a way, after I give this talk, as we start chatting, we'll actually be doing what is a Talanoa, which is a conversation. It's a sharing of ideas and talking with someone, whether it's formal between chiefs or informal between a circle of friends or colleagues. And it can be used to share ideas, teach skills, resolve problems, and also to help solve some of the kind of challenges that we all face. So my talk briefly, just a bit overview, is what I would like to do is make sure today I want to cover what are human rights and rights-based approaches and why does it matter, in particular in conservation. I want to make sure we have an understanding of what are the responsibilities of duty bearers to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of rights holders. And then once we've got some of that foundational knowledge, this is what I would like to spend the bulk of my talk on, is to really talk through and to give you some examples and share some stories around rights-based approaches in the Pacific. And I want to be able to draw from a lot of these examples to show you in particular how we are working in the Pacific, where we're at, and some of the thinking that we're doing. And as I give the talk, EJ asked me what kind of provocative question I should ask you. And for me, this would be it. I think it's really important. I'd love to hear people's thoughts around this, is what kind of investment is needed to ensure that rights-based approaches are integrated, are integral, and really become the norm in conservation. So a little bit to set the scene. So the world of environment and human rights, I think are starting to really strongly overlap and are starting to merge very quickly. So what it means is those that are working on human rights are starting to branch out and work more and more on environmental issues. And those that are working on environmental issues are increasingly considering and are being required to consider or integrate human rights into their work. In the conservation space, we're seeing human rights considerations largely focused around due diligence, meaning we're seeing it as part of kind of being required to do impact assessments. Large projects more and more in the Pacific are being asked to do develop environmental and social safeguards for their projects as well. However, the hope is, and this is my hope, and I think people like Helen, we've had discussions about this, is that we go beyond that, right? Shouldn't be just, we're not doing human rights just because due diligence or we're managing risks, but really the hope is that we move towards seeing that human rights are really core to doing conservation and becomes just the day-to-day way which we work in conservation. Now, because I think these spaces are still merging together, it means that it's in a bit of a state of flux, right? We don't know where it's going to settle and what is eventually good practice going to look like. So I feel like we're in that kind of emergent stages. There's still lots of learnings that are coming out, but it's still very newly coming together. And that's kind of evident from, for example, the way it's only more recently, the way it's been integrated, for example, into some of the more recent conventions like the Global Biodiversity Framework. The other thing, for those of you that maybe don't work in this space, I thought it'd be useful to share this also was a really quite historic decision that has also brought human rights and the environment space closer together. And in 2022, the UN General Assembly formally recognized the right to a healthy environment as a fundamental human right. That means now every single one of us is entitled, right, to that right, to clean air, to safe drinking water, to a safe climate. I put up that document up there that came out in 2018, as I think it was a very useful document for me in my kind of learning around thinking about human rights and the environment and when it came together. And in this document, it has a number of like principles, but also some direction on how you might implement and bring these two spaces together. One of the things that, one of the first two kind of principles that kind of really come out in the first, when you open it, that I really like, because this, to me, these two principles basically are arguing that environmental problems and social injustices are not separate things, but are actually like almost like the two sides of the same coin. And in particular, I like this particular saying that I wanted to kind of share with you, because to me, this is what I use a lot to inspire me and inspire a lot of my colleagues, is that environmental and social issues cannot be separated, and a thriving planet cannot be one that contains widespread human suffering or restricts human potential, and humanity cannot exist on a dying planet. There is also, when you're working in this space, there's also ethical, from an outcome perspective, a legal perspective, reasons, there are important reasons why human rights matter in conservation. And I'll just go over these very, very briefly. So from an ethical point of view, it's really important because conservation actions can impact the lives and livelihoods of people, particularly, for example, in my part of the world, Indigenous people, local communities who live in, are very dependent on biodiversity. And a rights-based approach ensures that conservation's efforts respects the dignity, the rights of individuals, and actually actively prevents negative consequences for them. So there's a real ethics to why we should be doing this. It's also important to do from a conservation outcomes point of view. And by this, I mean that if you don't do it, your outcomes are likely not to be sustainable or not likely to work. And so it's really important to nest human rights into conservation practice. And this will make sense if you think about like the root causes of environmental degradation, right? Often a lot of the root causes of environmental degradation are strongly linked to things in some places like poverty, inequalities, lack of secure rights. By addressing these issues, you're more likely to succeed in terms of your conservation efforts, because you're actually addressing some of these underlying causes. And then, of course, there's a legal argument, because our countries, we sign up to conventions, we're seeing more of the human rights language in the environmental space. And it's also probably in some of the, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but I know in the Pacific, some of that language now is getting more and more integrated into our climate policies and our environmental policies in the Pacific as well. So who is responsible for these? So it's important to understand that the states, so our governments are really the primary duty bearers, and they hold the primary obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And so we often call them the primary duty bearers. These are the state actors, but also every one of us also that work with the organizations, whether it's universities like yourself, whether companies, private sector, environmental NGOs, we all also have an important role as duty bearers and are often referred to as secondary duty bearers. So it's really important to understand that there is a role for government, but there's also a role for all of us in the way we engage and work with rights holders. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sort of crash course, a bit of foundational knowledge, because what I really wanted to do is now kind of start segueing into sharing a bit more about what we're doing in the Pacific. And in the Pacific, we are starting to think of, well, how are we going to help and support conservation practitioners actually consider human rights when they're doing their conservation work? And so one of the approaches that we've done recently, about a year and a half ago, is we started to have a look at all the different human rights that were out there, which are 30 plus of them. And we actually have started off with a much smaller subset. And so we went through and we worked with some human rights colleagues, and we identified 12 human rights to start off with that we felt would most resonate with environmental groups, and that would be a really good starting point to think about how to bring this into the conservation space. So this is not to say that these are the only important rights, right? This is more trying to use these as an entry point to gauge people into this space. And as you can see, I won't read each one of them, but they range everything from obviously the right to healthy food, water, work, but also rights to non-discrimination, gender equality, inclusive participation and democratic governance as well. The other thing that we try and emphasize working with conservation groups is, again, it's to try and make them feel comfortable in this space, because what you don't want is you start introducing ideas and you immediately getting pushback and resistance. And so, we want to make sure as we go through each of them, we've been working to try and link these very much to the work they're doing. But we also, rather than making them feel like they are starting from scratch and now they've got a new thing to do, we always start with what are they already doing and what are some of the rights that they're already working towards enhancing as a foundation to better see which areas that they are as a sector working on and doing really well, and then which ones maybe there's a gap or that there needs to be more efforts into. Before, I just want to make sure I'm not getting people confused with jargon, because I tend to swap quite comfortably between the two, but I just want to make sure we understand that the definitions of what human rights are, obviously the rights that we've been talking about that are inherent to all human beings, and that's different from human rights-based approaches. I put that kind of official definition up there. I just never liked it. I just get so tripped on the jargon. So you're welcome to look at that. But for me, I just tend to like to think of things simply is the rights-based approach is the what you do to implement, to operationalize these things, right? And to me, rights-based approaches really is about seeking to analyze inequalities that are out there that lie at the heart of conservation problems and address discriminatory practices, unjust distributions of power, etc., that impede conservation progress and result in people being left behind, for example. So in the Pacific, I'm not going to go through all 12 examples, and so what I thought I would do is actually just choose 3 to talk about, so kind of choose 3 of those human rights that you saw on that circle, and then talk about the kind of rights-based approaches we're using in some of these spaces that we're doing in conservation in the Pacific. Okay. So the first one I want to talk to is obviously about the rights of Indigenous people. And this is obviously really important in terms of making sure conservation projects must put in place the social safeguards to respect and protect Indigenous rights to lands, their waters, and their resources that they've traditionally owned, occupied, or used. We're a bit lucky, I always feel, in the Pacific, in that the Pacific is dominated by Pacific Islanders, and while we might have had colonial processes in the past, the cultures are very much alive, and it is really, apart from a few countries, Pacific Islanders that are running their countries, governing their countries, and therefore a lot of their cultures are being strongly retained as part, it's really embedded into all aspects of our society. So like, for example, in Fiji, where I'm from, 88% of our land is actually owned by Indigenous Fijians, and they also have access rights to the marine waters as well. And so they have these customary fishing grounds as well. And so land-sea tenure, for example, is very strongly part of lots of parts of the Pacific and really strongly supported by the laws and policies in our countries. So in terms of rights-based approaches, I wanted to kind of share about locally managed marine areas. I'm not sure, maybe some of you already know about these, but this is a great example of a tool that is really strongly used, especially in marine conservation in Fiji and some other parts of the Pacific. The term locally managed marine area really has been around for something like 25 years at this point. So it originated and it started up in 2000. And basically, a locally managed marine area is an area where a community is managing. In Fiji, it often aligns to their customary fishing ground, which you can see over here. And within it, they then use those resources, and they can set aside and set up rules that they would like to actually manage those resources. And often it's a combination of using some of the national law, but they also can impose some of their own restrictions as well. These things are more, I would say, is much more, even that the tenure has always been around in their time. The use of the LMMA in that term has really come up in 2000 as conservation organizations really engaged in starting to work with communities around supporting community-based resource management. The other things that they do is that they also integrate some traditional and customary practices, what we call tambus in the Pacific. And these are often temporary closures to support culture, can be for food, but it can also be used to replenish species that have depleted as well. And many of the motivations for community setting up are quite varied, and there's some research. There's a great paper I can always share about the different motivations, but they range from biodiversity to kind of fisheries management to livelihoods, looking to improve the income. So they really, communities are wanting to use this tool, are using this tool for really a range of different objectives and purposes. One of the things that's unique about it, and again, which I like about these sort of when you're thinking about rights-based approaches, is that this is not, it was never set up to be top down. The idea is it really starts when a community approaches, like some of the environmental NGOs or some of the academic institutions that support locally managed marine areas. So the request must come through the community, right? And it often focuses on an issue that they have identified. So it's not about us coming in to say, oh, you've got these problems, this is what we need to fix. They're the ones that come up with the issue, and then you're working with them to actually develop some of the solutions. And in that process, you can use then the opportunity to kind of bring traditional ecological knowledge as well as scientific knowledge together so that you're really helping communities co-design and think about the solutions that they need for the problems that they face. And so it's quite incredible, I think, coming back, like I was there in 2000, the very beginning of my career, when I went to the first workshop that set up the term, and it's quite incredible for me to see over 25 years how much this is spread over Fiji. So this is Fiji, the green are the two islands, Viti Levu and Vanua Levu, and I'm based out here in the capital, Suva. And all of these boundaries you can see are the customary fishing ground. The ones that you see in yellow are ones that have some kind of locally managed marine area. And within that, we've also mapped out the kind of network of tambus. And so something like over 70% of our inshore waters, so from the high water mark out to the edge of the reef, which is where the traditional fishing ground is under some kind of management right now. So this is, as you can see, is just an incredible tool that has really taken off and is being used widely across and in Fiji. And it's really shaping, and it really shapes a lot of the conservation efforts that we do in country. So one of the things I want to do is share, as I share these different kind of approaches, is to share, I guess, what has been successful and what I love about these tools or these approaches, but also to share that there are still, with each one of these, I don't want to just give you the rosy picture, there are still challenges that we face even around locally managed marine areas. And in 2018, I think it was, we collaborated with some colleagues at the Imperial College of London and at, I want to say Sussex University, but I think I'm going to get it wrong, another one of the other universities in the UK, to have a look, and they partnered up with locally managed LMMA, locally managed marine area partners in Fiji, and we wanted to look at, well, after 20 years of working on LMMAs, what have we achieved? Have they been affected? And we wanted to look at the impact in particular. What we found was that LMMAs did lead, so I have to read it from here, did lead to improvements in mechanisms that we hypothesized that would improve conservation outcomes. So it improved things like participation in decision-making, knowledge, eventual sort of management, the tools, like a wider diversity of tools that are being used, as well as financial support as well. But these mechanisms didn't necessarily, and these were done with perception, these were done with socioeconomic surveys with communities, but these mechanisms did not really deliver, from their perspective, the desired social, economic, or perceived ecological health outcomes. And this was a bit surprising given how much the investment has been there. You'd hope that if you're investing in a tool and it's been around for 10 to 15 years, that eventually you would see some positive effects from that would be recognized by communities, but that wasn't really the case. So in general, people felt positive about them, but it wasn't really, it wasn't very significant. And so we basically, from this work, have sort of concluded that really as practitioners, we need to evaluate and really adapt maybe some of the mechanisms that, that we think or that we expect to generate impact to LMMAs and impacts for people and for nature. So even this sort of tool, we're now going through a process to think about what do we need to change in this tool and to start to critically evaluate why it's maybe no longer or not working. Not working as well as it intended and not delivering the outcomes that actually the communities have identified. Okay, so that was just the first one. The second one I want to talk about is about the rights to inclusive, participatory, and democratic governance. And again, building on that LMMA model that I showed you, within LMMAs, there's often a strong investment around governance. And the governance has changed. We work within the traditional governance system, and we maintain and we respect and we continue to work within that and support that. However, there are also now more of committees that are now getting set up to better support in terms of natural resource management. So even within the kind of traditional governance system, there are different types of governance that are being, I guess, introduced into communities to actually support conservation. What is challenging, and this is really a really important right, and we are all, every single one of us, are entitled to the rights of inclusive, participatory, and democratic governance. But this actually, in reality, does have its challenges. And while we work in it in the Pacific, it does have challenges. So for example, in Fiji, this is quite challenging because the cultural systems that we work in are still very hierarchical and still quite patriarchal. And so that makes that challenging for us. And so what we've been starting to do is, while the LMMA, the guidance that was first developed, was supposed to really did promote inclusiveness, it tried to strengthen governance, it looked at building up environment committees that would be within communities. We've been starting to look at a deep dive and unpacking what does it mean to be truly inclusive. And this has been important because there's a growing dialogue, is that when we look at a lot of the practice out there, that there are groups that are being left behind or not really being engaged in the way that we would want to. And this is mainly around engagement of women, the engagement of youth, and also engagement of people living with disabilities as the sort of main groups that are just getting left behind. So we did some work, and we partnered up with Caroline Ferguson to have a look at some of this big data set that we had, but also to go back into the communities and to do a little bit of a deeper dive, interviewing both men and women around participation in governance, but in decision making, but specifically trying to understand the degree to which women were engaged in decision making around natural resource management. As you can see from this, you can see that the women, most of them that we interviewed, there's a much higher proportion of them. So we interviewed lots of the different types of groups and committees we have in a village. And you can see in terms of the women's group, vast majority of them said they don't attend meetings or participate in decision making. And this includes in areas where there's been locally managed marine areas where we've been working. And the other thing is, when we also ask them, looking at their level of support, we also can see, right? They can see there's a bit of a relationship between those that feel that they highly support management decisions, right? are ones where you see a much higher kind of participation, whereas you get very low support, right, when you're seeing participation is also very low. So these are some of the things that we are starting to unpack and think and look at in more detail around the inclusion of women and women's voices in particular in natural resource management. And I think it's much easier telling it in their voice rather than mine. So here are just some of the examples. I won't read out all of them. So like here, talking about someone's personal development. When I was appointed to take up this role, so this is probably a role on natural resource management, I was a shy and voiceless woman. I prayed to God that God grant me the confidence to be able to do it and carry out my duty. And I've grown in that area very much. The best way to address this, you know, in terms of working with men, is to learn to work together. It's time for women to move in and be part of decisions and bring great ideas and solutions to some of the issues that we haven't seen. And this is really important because often as practitioners coming from the outside, we make a lot of assumptions. And assumptions we've made is that when we've invited women and we spend all this effort getting women to our workshops to be part of the discussions around making management plans, that they feel that we're capturing enough of the women from a community and they feel included. And it was also important to understand the different perspectives. And I haven't put this up here, but when we interviewed men feel very positively. They felt like, yes, I can give you examples of how much now women are engaged and are doing this, and they're now on this committee. But the women's answers are not as positive as the men. And the women are more saying, well, I don't get to speak on this. I don't get to go to this, only the men go to this. So there's a difference within that cultural system that's not really discussed, right? Because there's strong gender norms around the roles that women are now starting to want to play in their communities and around decision-making around natural resource management. Okay, I go for time, that's good. Okay, so I've kind of given two examples I wanted to give of thinking about two human rights and rights-based approaches, like working at the community level. And what I'd like to do is shift to a little bit of my passion space, which is around thinking about gender equality, but in particular as a human right, and thinking about this in the fisheries space. I'm one of these people that doesn't see fisheries as separate from conservation. To me, it's part of conservation. And in the Pacific, we definitely don't see, the cultural systems do not see these things as separate. In going through this example, I want to do a little bit of a shift away from kind of community-based on-the-ground work and to talk to you more about the institutionalization, right, of gender equality, and how do we institutionalize these concepts and these principles and standards in organizations. And I'm particularly interested in this because I got particularly interested in this, and this is why I did this for my Pew Fellowship, because I could see the amount of money and organizations that we have in the Pacific and how much they are going to lots of these organizations, and they are in turn getting money with the idea of then using it to support local communities. How an institution designs and thinks and understands these concepts will have a strong influence on the way they're doing and applying conservation. And so I thought it was really important to see, therefore, where we are at in the Pacific, to get a bit of a baseline to know where we are at in terms of thinking about gender equality as a human right, sitting in the fishery space. And if we could understand where the sector is at, we could understand where the gap is and where we might need to invest in. So I done a lot of work with my colleague Sarah Lawless, and from James Cook University when she was doing her PhD, and we partnered up to have a look at some of the gender inclusion approaches that were being applied in practice and are being used within projects and institutions, fisheries institutions in the Pacific, and to understand some of the knowledge gaps. So we went and did this work in 3 countries, in Fiji, Solomons, and Vanuatu, interviewed about 100 people who work on fisheries. So we're not interviewing fishers, it's the institutions that deliver, design fisheries projects. And this is what we found. We found, like, we asked them questions to understand some of their motivations. And these are the percentages tell you how many of respondents what percentage of respondents gave particular answers, and we asked what their motivations were for including gender equality into their work. Most of them said either number 2 or number 3. And what's interesting thing about this is that 2 and 3 is, remember when I said, people would, there's often the ethical reason, we might do gender equality or work on rights-based approaches for outcomes. This one speaks to, these first two speaking to them thinking about outcomes. So what they're saying is basically they're working on gender equality for the purpose of, because they're interested in the outcome of sustainable fisheries. And that's a different motivation, right, for groups that answer they're doing it because they recognize that gender equality is a fundamental human right. What I haven't shown that's interesting is that we also interviewed a number of groups that are in these development organizations that work on gender. They always answer this. So there's a real difference, this is really important, in the motivations right now of why fisheries institutions are thinking about gender equality. And I think that's really important to know and understand. When we looked at their different approaches, I wanted to look at them to say, well, okay, we've got all these, we asked them, just tell me, what are the different approaches you are currently using to integrate and think about gender equality in your work? Just list as many as you can. And then when we got these long lists of approaches, I wanted to start to organize them. And I actually borrowed this framework that came from the agricultural sector, in which I then looked at the different approaches and I grouped them into approaches that really, what they've described, really only reach men and women participants. And that's the bulk of them. So everything the majority of what people are describing, right, are around what's going to reach them. So an example of that could be like me today. I'm here, I'm standing, I'm talking and sharing something I probably reach you, but I'm not likely to be maybe doing some of these other things, right? And so you can see then 28% of the approaches that were described really ones that might benefit, like we're delivering access, trainings, or resources. You get even less that are actually the approaches they're using that are actually going to empower the ability of men or women to make strategic choices. And then very few are in this kind of transformative end of the spectrum where they're actually, the approaches they're using are actually addressing some of the underlying sort of gender norms and stereotypes that are within the sector. And so this is really important. So it doesn't mean, this is not saying that this is more important. What I'm trying to say is it's very strongly skewed at this end of the spectrum, and the investments are very few of them at this end. And this is often the end, if you work with gender development organizations, this is the end of the spectrum that they are working at and are working towards. So these are just some of the examples so that you can see the number of people that kind of gave different examples. You can see a massive skew towards community consultation processes, which is what, the first two kind of examples I was giving at. And so most people are describing what they do at the community, often to engage men and women, doing separate men and women's focus groups, how they try and engage women in the process. Number that are focused on projects just for women, but you can see again where the skew is, where people are working in, and less the spaces where they're not working as much in. And just here are just a couple of sayings, because this is why I love qualitative research, the wonderful quotes and what people really share with you. So I had a government colleague, I think that was in Vanuatu, saying that gender keeps slipping through the cracks. We have lots of regional organizations who was very blunt with us, saying the old guard who sees gender issues as being politically correct and seeing gender as something to tick off to get donors off their back. So these are our regional organizations sharing in confidence that obviously, even within regional organizations, their motivations are a bit skewed right now, especially in their senior leadership. And then an NGO explaining that, there's challenges of working in the field. Traditional barriers mean we can't push gender too much. We need to do it slowly. We need the support of men and chiefs. And so we need to do it subtly. So One thing I just want to highlight, and then we've got a couple more slides left, is we did this interview, we asked them to describe their different approaches, understanding how they felt about gender equality, how their comfort level, etc. And then after the conversation right at the end, we said, right, given everything you've said and shared with us, what do you think your capacity is right now? And what you can see is a real skew is that given everything that people, given all the graphs I've just shared, people generally are feeling very, very positive about where they are at in terms of integrating gender equality into their fisheries work. And I just gave a couple of examples to show the kind of reasoning, right, why people are ranking things high. And only very few are ranking them very at the kind of lower end. And what this means is you've got a sector that is very skewed to working on a very narrow set of approaches. Remember, at that reach end of the spectrum, very little at the transformative end. But because they are very new to this space, right, and they're really much in their infancy, they think they're doing very well because they don't, as a sector, know where best practice should be. And so this again speaks back to my kind of original question, is as we set norms and we think about where we need to, how we integrate rights and rights-based approaches into it, we need to know where we're going and what that standard should be. And without that, right, different sectors like, for example, fisheries are going to struggle to know how to change. So these are just, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, just to share that as part of this work, if you want to learn more, these are then some of the kind of solutions that people kind of provided, especially those that work in the gender equality space, around some of the kind of investments that are maybe needed in the Pacific to actually start transforming that sector a lot more. So everything from political will to making sure we have capacity and resources to do this a lot better. So with that, because 40 minutes goes very, very quickly, I'm going to come back to the original one. So I've given you some examples of like what it looks like in the field to do rights-based approaches, like in the Pacific, talked about some of the kind of challenges and about how you institutionalize this. Given all that, I want to come back and remind us of the original question, therefore, what does it mean? Like, what are we going to have to do to be able to integrate this into conservation and make this normal? And whether that's working on research or working on the ground, this is a really important question to start thinking about. And it's not one, I think all of us work in that space, I think are still trying to figure that out, what we need to do, what's the best investments to make. And so I think it's a really great place to have a good conversation and a bit of a talanoa. So with that, I'd like to say thank you.